You are about to receive a phone call from the correctional facility. The conversation will be recorded.
After the inquest into William Tyrrell's disappearance finishes hearing evidence in public,
If you do not wish to receive this call, please hang up now.
a lawyer for the New South Wales State Coroner sends me an email
This call is originating from the Shortland Correctional Centre.
with a link to dozens and dozens of exhibits that were tendered at the inquest, including witness statements, photographs, things we've never seen before.
Hello.
Going mate.
Hi, Frank.
How is it? How are you? Good?
And these recordings of Frank Abbott inside prison in November 2019, where Frank is serving time for sexually abusing children. And here he's talking on the phone to a Christian pastor, Martin Parish, and his wife, Jeanette.
I'm really good, thank you. How are you?
Oh, not too bad. We've had that many lock-in days. It's not funny.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we didn't
It's
get
the
out till-
first time we've heard these recordings, which have never previously been made public. And listening to them,
Is there
the first thing that strikes me
Why are you being
No,
like this?
we was locked in all day yesterday.
is that Frank, who, and I'll stress this, Frank's in prison for sexually and indecently assaulting children. Frank is whinging.
We had 4 full days and 2 half days and a quarter days lock-ins so far in the last couple of weeks.
That's no good.
No.
Frank says he's been locked up for too long inside his prison cell.
Yeah, yesterday we never got our breakfast till 10 o'clock, and then up past 11 they brought their lunch around.
Right.
Frank complains the prison breakfast was late coming and lunch was too early. I mean, diddums.
I talked to Les and David a few days ago now.
Yep.
But then Frank says he's spoken to his 2 surviving brothers, Les and David. He says the police investigating William's disappearance have been up to see them.
They've been up there and seen them.
You're talking to the police.
Yeah.
Frank says the cops asked his brothers about a murder.
Yeah. They're talking about that murder bill I was on back in 1990-something.
A murder Frank was charged with, and where he was found not guilty.
And I beat the charge in the second trial. I had 4.5 week trial and got hung jury. And then that second trial, 12 months later, I had another 4.5 weeks and found not guilty, but they still bring it up.
The cops are still bringing it up, Frank says,
They say, oh, he's done this and he's done that. We think he might have done this one.
saying, oh, he's done this and he's done that. We think he might have done this one. The priest answers,
Yeah, well, that's their thinking.
Yeah.
and Jeanette Parish chips in.
Not fair, is it? I mean, if you're found not guilty, you should be able to say, I'm not guilty.
But what exactly do the police mean by saying, we think he might have done this one? Were they talking about William? If so, Frank denies it.
Yeah, well, I should have told them that, you know, if I knew anything, I'd be the first to tell them.
That beat means the conversation has to end soon. You only get a few minutes on a prison phone call.
Anyway,
No.
he said, things are going good. He said,
Yeah.
God bless you all, and I'll ring you
Thank
again
you, mate.
later.
In the rush to end the call, nobody seems to ask Frank, who was it he was found not guilty of murdering?
Okay,
God
bye,
bless,
love.
Frank.
Bye.
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 I'm Dan Box, and from news.com.au, this is Witness William Tyrrell. Episode 13. Helen. Helen Mary Harrison was a teenager with dark hair and a bright smile, and she was all of 17 years old, but looked younger as she left work at the local store in Pitt Town in Western Sydney on Saturday the 16th of March 1968. It was hot that afternoon, early autumn, and a storm was building up as Helen set out to cycle the few kilometres through farmland and scattered houses to her home and her family. Only she never got there. Today, few people remember Helen, but among them is her brother, Peter. I meet him in a cafe in a built-up part of Western Sydney, where Peter brings his old handwritten notes from decades ago and fading newspaper clippings. Peter was 14 when it happened, but today he's an old man. And sitting together, it feels like he's wrapped up in grief or silence or something. He's hesitant. His words stop and start or trail away. Later, we sit in the sunlight coming through a small window in his home, and I ask him to tell me about his sister.
Well, being older than us, he was working, had more of her own life than myself and my brother at home.
And what kind of a person was she? Looking back, how do you think of her?
Well, she actually had to cycle to work at Pitt Town, which is quite a distance, 4 or 5 kilometres to Pitt Town. But apparently she used to sing on the bike, other people had told us. And just worked in the general store.
So she used to sing on the bike as she cycled to and from work?
Yes, and more of a social life than my brother and I.
How would you describe her physically as you remember her?
Oh, quite good looking and more mature than us. That's about as much as I can.
Can I, and I'm sorry to do this, can I ask what you remember of what happened to her?
Oh, certainly remember it all. On the day where there was a big storm in Pitt Town, fairly hot weekend. When a hot day turns into a storm, and we believe this is maybe part of the reason she accepted a lift because of the rain.
And what came next?
Oh, we're waiting and waiting on the afternoon. But she didn't come out. Excuse me.
Peter takes a moment, looking out the window, as his memory reaches back across the decades.
But it was later in the day, I think 4 or 5, and my father, he was driving around looking all through the night, really. We didn't know what had happened.
And the police became involved, and can you remember much of their investigation at the time?
The police, I think, only... in the beginning, they didn't think anything had happened to her. They thought she may have run off, left home, shot through somewhere, but she was happy at home. No reason to do that. And they didn't try and look at all. For the first early days.
And how did that feel?
Well, it was a bit hopeless for everyone. We didn't... just kept on just driving around and talking to people and asking if they... And local people told us they'd seen a blue utility and 3 people in it. I think it was 3 or Helen in the middle. Someone had seen a bike in the back of a blue utility. That was the rumour.
But this was your family doing the looking? At this point, the police weren't looking.
I don't think they were until the basket was discovered.
That was Helen's basket.
I think it was about a week later. That was the first clue of where she may have been.
And then they started to look?
Yes, and then they found in the bushland there the shallow grave off the side of the road there.
Can I ask how that was for you as a child and for your parents?
Well, very traumatic, of course, then. But it was worse for my mother than anybody. It was a big loss in a lot of ways.
And that loss is something you've lived with. I imagine your parents lived with for the whole of their lives without ever maybe being given an answer as to exactly what happened by the police and the courts.
Yes, that is true. There's been no firm result about Abbott, although we've had 2 trials and a lot of hearsay evidence and some stronger evidence, which has all amounted to nothing in the end as far as finding out the truth.
And watching all of that over the years, and it was decades, what do you think looking back at that now?
It seemed to be that this type of murder case, as it was unknown. Or that anyone had heard of before in the Moralia district, Pitttown district. And it was just more hard to deal with, I suppose. And yes, even with a lot of evidence of some degree and opinions from other people, and a missing watch, which Abbott had boasted about. He's told other people that they've seen Helen's watch in the glove box of the car.
Did Helen wear a watch?
Oh, yes.
We'll come back to that watch later.
And we thought the police would have been taking more action and interviewing more people, that type of thing.
And later, when Abbott was eventually charged and taken to court, when we met, you said you had doubts about the jury system based on what you've been through.
The whole thing is just hanging on a jury, and it only takes one person not to agree with it, because and then the whole jury can fail. And some people possibly weren't happy with the decision and just said yes or no.
And you would have seen Frank in the courtroom?
Yes, I saw him in the court and going in, but I never saw him coming out.
Could you describe him?
No, he's a stand over me. Yeah, literally, that's what people used to say. That's a word I've heard. It threatened them from what other people say, but he did look a bit fearsome, I suppose.
Frank looked fearsome enough that even his own lawyer described him in court as someone who stands over people to get his way. But that doesn't make him a murderer, the lawyer argued, and as the jury found. Looking back at what happened, what are your regrets?
Oh, the time factor. Helen died in 1968. Our trial wasn't until 91 or 2. That's ridiculous. 23 or 4 years. And literally, that's terrible.
And what have you heard from the police since that trial?
Very little, if any, that I can remember.
It's now 50 years or more since Helen went missing. And we've heard Frank's name in the years since in relation to the William Tyrrell investigation. You said the police haven't contacted you since the trial. Do you still have any hopes that what happened to your sister can be resolved? What do you hope for now?
I would like to see a resolution. But because there has been a lot of evidence over the years, a lot of people interviewed and provided their thoughts and some facts. And it's all come to nothing. In spite of 2 court cases after all this time. And we know Abbott is a bad person, and the sheer amount of stories, really, there's got to be more interest put in Abbott.
You'd like to see the police pay more attention to Frank Abbott?
Certainly. Yes. It's a very old case, but there's a lot of unsolved answers, questions.
After, walking outside, Peter's bicycle is standing up against his garage wall. He says he cycles, like his sister Helen, and I think of her cycling home from work on that day, singing. It's an image that I can't shake, and nor can Nina, the producer on this series.
All right, thank you both.
Nina has spent months now trying to find out more about Helen's death and what happened after.
So, what I want to do today is take you through what I found out about the
This
various
afternoon,
things
she's
that
asked me and Gary Jubilin to join her in the studio.
happened. And this information is based on court documents that I've been able to find and newspaper articles that were written at the time.
Gary's one of the detectives who led the investigation into William Tyrrell's disappearance. He's got a checkered history with the case, which we've talked about a lot earlier in this series. But nobody disputes Gary knows police work. He spent 34 years in the New South Wales Police Force, most of them investigating homicides.
And what I'm going to try and do is present it to you in a way that's not my opinion. You know, I'm trying not to colour it. So if you think I am doing that, speak up. Let me know.
Okay. Just the facts, ma'am.
Just the facts. All right. Shall we get started?
All right.
Okay. So it's 1968. Let's start with Frank Abbott and what he was doing in 1968. So Frank's in his 20s and he's living with his parents in Kingswood, which is a suburb in the west of Sydney. It's not too far from Penrith.
Okay. So it's far west of Sydney.
Yeah.
Right.
Frank's from a big family. He's got lots of brothers and sisters. And he's also, I guess, what you'd call like a petty criminal. So car theft, burglary, break and enter, that kind of level of criminal, right?
So how old is he roughly?
In his sort of mid to late 20s.
Mid to late 20s, okay.
Yeah. So that's Frank at that point. About half an hour from Kingswood is Pitt Town. And that is where Helen Harrison, who's 17 at the time, is working.
I do know Pitt Town, and what are we talking, 68? That would have been a very small place.
Small place.
It's right on the fringe of Sydney where it's more bush than city. At this point.
Acres and farmland and all that, Pitt Town. Yep.
Yeah, Helen at the time, she was really reliable, go to work, come home. On the 16th of March 1968, she left work about 12:45 p.m. And she hopped on her bike to ride home, as she always did. People saw her leave, but she never made it home. She was not the kind of teenager who would just go off without telling her parents. So they raised the alarm pretty quickly. There's a search and they just can't find her.
How good would a search have been from the police at that time, Gary, 68?
It would literally be driving around on the roads, and they wouldn't have the communication. A 17-year-old girl leaving a store, riding on a country road. I dare say that the search would be that she hasn't been involved in an accident or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be a cursory drive along the roadways on the most likely path that she would have taken.
So it's not flooding the area like we saw with William Tyrrell?
I wouldn't imagine. 17-year girl on a bike, 68. So I think that's what the search would have been.
So it's about a week later, they find Helen's body. She's in a shallow grave in East Currajong, which is around the area. She was murdered and she was found naked from the waist down. I don't think that they have a cause of death.
Do you know anything about, you said it was a shallow grave, but sort of where it was?
It was in the bush.
East Currajong.
Yeah.
You've got Pitt Town in the plains, Windsor Plains, Richmond. East Currajong is as you're starting to go up into the Blue Mountains.
Okay.
So that would have been,
It's a bit wilder again.
So that would be a place you'd take someone.
It's even further out of Sydney. It's more remote. You've gone through this kind of idyllic country edge and now you're getting into the mountains.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
They found the body and she had been paid at her job about $20. That was missing. Her watch was missing.
Jesus, really?
Her underwear was missing and her bike was missing at that time, but they did find that a few months later.
Gary, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Which isn't a pleasant question at all. None of this is pleasant. If you find a teenager's body roughly a week after she's died, in 68, how do you tell she's been sexually assaulted?
Could be damage around the vagina or the anus. That might have been because the flesh, potentially the flesh is still there. So it's brutal.
There's not going to be modern day forensics. There's no DNA.
Maybe they'd swab for blood back then, but it's not DNA. So
She was naked from the waist down as well.
Okay, so there's that.
So there's no immediate obvious suspect for the police. So I wanted to ask you, Gary, I imagine this kind of seemingly random attack where you don't have that obvious suspect, that's got to be one of the hardest kind of crimes to solve, I'd imagine.
Stranger murders are what we consider most difficult ones.
But would you assume it was a stranger murder?
I'm just answering the stranger murders are the most difficult ones, but you'd be thinking, okay, a stranger murder if someone was just driving along the road, but you'd be looking at all the local people around there, who knew her, who knew she rode that route. You're looking at people that, victimology is the early part of a murder investigation, finding out what her lifestyle is, what her patterns were, the fact that the local community all knew she rode home that way. Well, that would open up suspects to everyone in the community or potential suspects.
So as a cop, you'd actually, on the basis of that, almost be walking into town and looking at potentially anybody there.
And then line of questioning, you'd speak to her family and friends, anyone that's been paying particular attention to her. Anyone that stands out in the community that's a little bit strange in the behaviour. So that would be the way you'd work the community.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the police did. So they cast a pretty wide net. They're following up every possible lead. By the time the case goes to trial decades later, the court hears that the police have spoken to thousands of people in relation
Thousands?
to thousands.
So in 68, the cops had put that much work into it.
You'd be astounded. Like some of the old school investigations, they were fascinating, the amount of detail. We didn't have computers, it wasn't electronic, but there was a card system in place and you'd have boxes of cards and a bit of information would be stored alphabetically in the system.
And like cross-reference between cards.
Yeah, there was a lot of collating to be done. But yeah, they were thorough because they didn't have the benefits that we've got currently, like with CCTV footage, phone records, all that. So it was just that legwork. You had to go out and speak to people and that was the thing that solved cases.
Well, that's definitely what they were doing. And as far as I can tell from the court records that I have access to, Frank Abbott first comes onto their radar when a 16-year-old boy goes to the police in the weeks after Helen's murder, and he tells them that about 2 weeks before Helen's disappearance, he'd spoken to a passenger in an old white Cortina sedan who expressed an interest in Helen and her whereabouts.
And so that's all from court records?
Yeah. So a teenager goes to the police and said, hey, saw this guy in this car and he asked me about Helen.
When he asked him about Helen, that was prior to Helen disappearing?
2 weeks before.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's definitely a line of inquiry that you'd be wanting to follow up.
So they do, and they go to Frank and they ask him about it in April of 1968. So it's about a month after the murder. And he confirms that, yes, he was the passenger in that white Cortina, and he says his friend Trevor was driving, but he says he doesn't remember asking about Helen. Okay. He tells the police that he had met Helen a few months earlier at a dance and he'd seen her around since then. So when the police then asked him about his whereabouts on the day that Helen went missing, he said that he and his brother John visited a hotel in Penrith about 10:30 a.m., had a couple of beers, left by 12:30 p.m. John drove Frank to his home in Kingswood, where he stayed until about 4:30 when his other brother came and picked him up.
So that's again court records?
That's all in the court records.
Break that down, like 10:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m.
At the pub?
At the pub, and then his brother dropped him home.
Yeah, so he was at the pub with his brother John.
Yeah.
John drove him back to Kingswood, and then another brother came and picked him up.
And she disappeared. What time? She started at 12:45. She was riding the bike home. So he's given, basically, he's with his brother John at the critical stage.
So what time was she last seen?
12:45.
12:45. So he's left the pub just before then with his brother.
Yeah.
So the only alibi witness at the crucial time would be his brother.
Yeah, so that's my next question, Gary. You get that alibi given to you from a person of interest. Who do you speak to?
I'd go to the pub, see if they were together. That would be the first thing. And then I would be grabbing the brother as quickly as I could and lock him in, and then speaking to other people associated with the brother and associated with Frank to see if they corroborate it.
So the police don't speak to John, which is Frank's brother who he said he was with. Don't speak to John. In fact, no one speaks to John until decades later when it goes to trial. And at that point, John has no memory of any of it.
So again, it's court records saying that the cops do not speak to the person Frank nominates as his alibi witness.
Yes, and Justice Slattery will later say in court, such an interview might have been expected after the applicant told police he and his brother John had visited a hotel in Penrith for several hours up to 12:30 p.m.
It's an understatement, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely should have been spoken to, and you'd be checking his alibi. Like it's.
Does that make any sense to you? Like, if the cops are working this hard enough that they speak to thousands of people, but they don't speak to the brother who Frank says he was with at the time, why would that be?
And it comes down to, I think, leadership sometimes, directions, and sheer volume of information comes in. And like we're looking at it now, knowing what we know about Frank and the type of person he is.
Yeah.
At that point in time, he was in his mid-20s, mightn't have the criminal history. Okay, well, two blokes, they'd go for a drink at the pub. It mightn't have had that urgency.
Yeah, okay. So he's potentially just someone who's come up, just, okay, we've checked what he says he was doing, and we tick that box, move on, because they might have been looking at someone else.
They might have had. So I'm always cautious when we're looking at old investigations at what information did they have at the time.
We're not done with the alibis. So the police do speak to Trevor, who was the driver of the Cortina.
Hang on, so this is the guy
who was in the car with Frank when they spoke to that teenager.
Who said Frank was asking about Helen. Okay.
So Trevor said that he did remember Frank asking the teenager about a girl who lived nearby.
Okay, so you're ramping Frank up a little bit there.
A little bit. Yeah. And then they speak to another of Frank's brothers. So not John, who he said he was at the pub with, but Ted. Ted is the brother that Frank said came by in the afternoon and picked him up.
Right.
So Ted says that he was at work from 6:30 a.m. until 4 p.m. in Penrith, and then he went to his mum's place in Kingswood, which is where Frank was living, at 4:15 p.m, and he said Frank was there with his parents and a friend named Rodney.
Okay.
They also speak to Frank's mum, and so there's a record that she told police that Frank was home with her that afternoon.
Well, that might be why they don't speak to the brother who Frank actually says he was with.
But you'll notice that Ted has said that Frank was at home with a friend named Rodney.
Yeah.
Frank didn't mention that in his first alibi.
I hadn't noticed.
See, the problem is if they've not spoken to John, but they've spoken to Ted, so that they have got interest in him then. And then, so that they've missed John.
John's the crucial.
Yeah.
And you're right, you've spotted a contradiction in Frank's own account of what he was doing.
Yeah. So at this point, the alibi is a little bit muddy.
Oh, well, it's not.
It's
I'd
not
say
confirmed, right?
It's not an alibi. It's sort of all over the place.
And just to stress, everything that you're saying is coming from court records that you've got, that you've been through. So this is evidence the court has heard. Because, yeah, it does sound like if I was a cop working that one, I'd want to go back to Frank again and say...
Yeah, I was looking at that going, gee, if I was a cop, I think maybe I would have confirmed this. They didn't at this point.
What do you reckon to that?
Again, who knows what was operating on their minds, but if you're looking at the gold class, let's do it right. Obviously, you speak to John, and the moment, if Frank was a suspect, the moment Frank nominated John, I would be prioritising getting someone to speak to John before Frank has an opportunity.
And the moment you notice the contradiction between what his other brother says and what Frank said, you'd want to go back. And...
but you'd be getting to that person straight away, and don't let them be able to
and
collaborate.
I wonder if you're speaking to thousands of people, if you just have this running list of these are things we have to get to. We've got to confirm that person's alibi. We've got to confirm that person's alibi.
Literally, up until the electronic systems come in, we'd have a job book, and it'd be a book, and task number 1, go speak to Dan Box. Task number 2, go speak to Nina. And you just had to keep that the whole time.
And if all of these little contradictions or missing persons that you haven't spoken to are all in a card index... And there's going to be shelves of those cards, isn't there? Quickly. If you're speaking to 1,000 people, you're going to have boxes of cards and cross-references. Stuff is going to get lost.
It's not foolproof, but you can't justify not speaking to John. If Frank was a suspect and said he was driving.
So the investigation continues. They haven't given up. They're still casting this really wide net. They're still speaking to people all around the area. They find Helen's bike in September of 1968 in Berkshire, which is not where her body was found.
Berkshire Park's half an hour's drive from East Courier. It's a fair way away. And you'd have to have a car to move a bike that distance.
They keep doing interviews. One of the people that they interview is a man named Gary Grimson, who will become relevant later on. Gary gives a statement to the police, and I can tell you, according to court records, that in 1968, when Gary Grimson spoke to the police, he did not say anything to implicate Frank. Their thinking at that point is that the offender is a local person. And they also, in an article at the time, flagged their interest in a pale blue Holden utility vehicle that was seen in the area of Helen's disappearance at the time. But I can tell you that they speak to Frank again in September, so a few months later. So this is 1969 by this point. And in that interview, Frank finally corrects his alibi. This is a quote.
Nina reads from Frank's own evidence, read out in court by the judge.
I made a mistake. What I'd done on that day, 16th of March, is as follows. On that morning, I got up about 8 or 8:30 a.m., went out and helped my friends Brian and Rodney and my father in the backyard. We were pulling Brian's car to pieces. He said he stayed in the backyard attending to the vehicle until about 11:30 a.m. And then, this is another quote, the 4 of us went up to the Shell station at Penrith to get some parts. On the way back, we went to Woodruff Street to see my brother Ted, and I stayed there until about 12:30 or a bit after, then went home for lunch, and I stayed at home with my father, brother, mother, and fixed the car, and later Brian and Rodney left. And he said he thought that was about 2 p.m. And then he stayed at home and worked around the shed with his father and his brother until about 6:30 or 7 p.m.
And he's nominated how many people that he was hanging out with?
His father, his mother, his brother. Rodney and Brian, he said, were there. They left about 2 p.m.
Okay. The crucial time, 12:45 to 1:45, however long. So that's, whoever he's claiming he was with, that's the crucial time of the alibi.
What do you make of the fact that he's changed his version of events completely? So within weeks of her disappearance, he gives one version of events, but months later, he changes his version of events completely. Do you read anything into that?
Anyone that changes an alibi, but to come out strongly and say, I was at this pub 10:30 to 12:30 and then driving with my brother.
Because that's the thing, it's precise, that first alibi, isn't it?
That, to me, something jumps out. I'm not sure if it's just the way it's been recorded, but I was at the pub 10:30 to 12:30 and then with my brother.
So this correction of Frank's alibi is in 1969.
The year after Helen goes missing.
So going back to Ted's statement, he doesn't mention Frank visiting him that day. In the statement that Frank gave in 1969, he said that about 11:30 a.m, the four of us went to the Shell station at Penrith and got some parts. On the way back, we went to Woodruff Street to see my brother Ted, and I stayed there until about 12:30.
So
Ted had said he went to work at 6:30 a.m. and worked all day till 4 p.m, didn't mention Frank coming to visit him.
So Frank gives one version of events, which is essentially contradicted by his brother Ted. Then Frank gives a different version of events, which also contradicts what his brother has previously said.
Yeah. So, again, you would think you'd check the alibi.
Yeah, 100%. The only way you can prove or disprove it is other people's accounts that can support it.
Do they do that?
Frank's father, Frank's brother John that we mentioned, Rodney Plackett, who was the man that he said he was with, Brian Stockman, who I think was another person who was at the house, they were never interviewed by the police.
You're kidding. So, again, that's all from the court?
Yeah, this is all court records.
So those are people that Frank said he was with?
Yeah.
They're never interviewed by police?
Mm-mm. I'm not speculating or offering opinions here.
I'm offering an opinion. That's really bad. Yeah. I don't know, not got anything to say about Frank, but in terms of the police investigation, that's really bad.
And this was criticised in court, and this was used to form part of the defence in court. So decades later in court, Frank's lawyer will assert that at that point in the investigation, so say 1969, on the available material, there was no forensic evidence linking the applicant to the crime. There was no identification evidence and no eyewitness evidence. So at this point, the police didn't have anything solid.
Well, yeah, that's fair enough. There is actually no evidence linking Frank to the murder at this point at all.
Yeah.
Okay.
At this point, Frank seems to be out of the investigation.
Yeah. Right.
Over the next few years, he gets married to a woman named Katrina. He's also in and out of jail for various crimes, none of them violent crimes, minor crimes. Right. Yeah. So, again, break and enter, stealing cars. So he and Katrina, they seem to have a bit of a tumultuous marriage in that various reports from that time seem to say they're together, then they're not together. They have 2 children together, I believe. But again, on and off, he's in and out of jail too. In 1977, so we're skipping ahead here.
Almost 10 years now.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
2 women related to Katrina Abbott go to the police.
So 2 women related to Frank's wife?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go to the police.
Yeah.
So one is Katrina's cousin. And what she tells the police, and this is from court records, is that Frank took her and Katrina, his wife, to the bush site where Helen Harrison was found. And she said along that drive, Frank was beating his wife, Katrina, as they drove.
So as he's driving out to the site where Helen Harrison's body is found, with at least 2 women in the car with him, he is beating his wife?
That's what she said in her statement.
Which was heard in court?
Yeah.
All right. This evidence was heard in court during an early part of the legal process called a committal hearing, and it was heard again during the trial where Frank was found not guilty.
And she said he bragged about the killing, talked about it as if it was a big joke, and said that he'd scruffed the girl and he'd raped her. And she also says he showed them a watch in his glove compartment that he said was Helen's watch. She says that Abbott told her that he tried to date Helen Harrison at the shop where she worked in Pitttown, and Helen had refused him. Abbott also allegedly boasted to his wife about how the girl had not stopped screaming while being driven away from her home into the bush.
That's what a court would later hear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where he grabbed her by the throat and strangled her. So all of this was what Katrina's cousin told the police. She also said that Abbott had told her he had sex with the girl before killing her and again when she was dead. And she said, "I thought he must be sick in the head."
You said there were 2 women?
Yeah, so that's the first woman. So the other woman that went to the police in January of 1977 was Katrina's sister. And she told the police that Abbott had lured her into his car where he'd made a move on her and she'd refused his advances and was crying and she was pleading him to let her go.
Again, this evidence was heard in Frank's committal hearing and his trial.
But he took her out into the bush and he said, "You're like that other stupid bitch. I took her out to the bush and I soon shut her up." So she pleaded to be allowed to go home to attend to her young baby, but Abbott took her out into the bush. And she says in her statement to police, at knife point, it was a night-long ordeal where she was savagely raped 4 times.
Okay. All right. Gary?
Bragging about crimes, I carry a little bit of weight to it, but not... it's not a deal clincher for me.
Okay.
So someone bragging about a crime, he gets off on terrorising people. It might be part of his fantasy. What interests me that he does know her, he knew her in the area. It would have been a very small community.
Yeah.
Knowing that he knows her, disappeared, his alibi, and then if we accept, we're seeing the type of person he is. He's a predator, he's a rapist.
And again, look, he's not convicted of that. But that, as a detective, if you were looking at that, that would be what you'd be.
This is how I'd be
talking
as a briefing. Okay, so what have we got? We've got a bloke that knew her. His name's come up early in the investigation. His alibi hasn't been fully tested. We're now getting information that, okay, it hasn't been proved to court, but we've got the statement from the victim here saying she was raped at knife point.
He'd be someone you would want to pursue.
Oh, 100%.
I mean, she also said in her statement that he showed her the watch.
That's the thing.
And that was part of the watch, the clothing was,
her watch was missing.
And money taken,
That suggests he has got physical evidence that would link him, because that would be a clincher, wouldn't it?
Yeah, on that information, you could execute a search warrant.
And if you got the watch, you'd almost be looking at prosecuting.
If you had the watch, I'd say you've got circumstantial, but a strong circumstantial brief.
So you'd be potentially charging at that point.
You've got him linked to the crime.
Did they find the watch?
So this is a quote from one of the court records I found. After the women came forward, it seems that the police did not initiate any further investigation into the matter.
I can't pinpoint who I would criticise over that.
You might say you don't want to criticise, but there's a witness saying there might be physical evidence that would directly link him to the crime, which you say just on her account you could get a search warrant.
Yeah.
So the cops would be able to, within, honestly, hours, maybe day, get a search warrant, get his car, and see if that watch is there.
And where I think potentially the failing, just knowing the organisation, everyone's operating in silos. That might be information passed on to a local detective. You then got homicide squad stationed somewhere else, and information like that, because of the manner in which it was stored. Like, it's not, you can't access a computer. It would have been the old card system. So it'd be me picking up, speaking to Pitt Town Police Station. Is the detective on? Can you get him to check that?
Yeah. I will flag that the 2 women that came forward to the police were Aboriginal women.
Yeah, well, what
does that make you think?
Well, you'd like to think it doesn't count, but victims get judged whether we say or not, and I don't want to tarnish the police that they dismiss them. I'd like to think it wouldn't happen, but I've got to say, in my experience, I've seen things like that happen.
You've worked cases where witnesses have been dismissed or not listened to who happen to be Aboriginal.
Oh, 100%.
And I've reported on cases, murders, serial killings, where Indigenous women have come forward and... In fact, there was a government inquiry 2 years ago into the murders of Indigenous women and children in this country.
Who gave evidence at the inquiry?
Well, I can tell you that they don't really know why it wasn't followed up. By the time the case did go to trial in the mid-90s, one of the 2 officers involved had died. And the other officer said that the one who was now dead was the one that had been left to handle everything post-interview, and he didn't know what happened.
So we can't ask him.
We do know Frank wasn't interviewed or even informed about those allegations.
So that's, again, the court records.
Court records, yeah. He wasn't charged, we know, at the time of any of those allegations. Frank's wife also wasn't interviewed at that time.
Because she was a witness. According to her cousin, she was in the car when Frank took being beat up when Frank... So the cops haven't interviewed Frank or the other witness. Okay, so we can't say that those two witnesses who've come forward were telling the truth because Frank hasn't been convicted of those offences.
Or charged.
Gary?
Oh, look, if you're asking me plain and simple, should it have been followed up? The clear answer is yes, it should have been followed up.
Yeah.
Years later, in court, Frank's lawyer would argue the women had an axe to grind due to an ongoing family dispute, though the women themselves denied this. Either way, nothing happened.
So, again, things go quiet at this point, and that next decade is pretty similar to the decade before. For Frank, he's in and out of jail for minor crimes. He's on and off with his wife.
So that's 20 years when Helen's family are just waiting.
Okay. No answers.
Right.
By 1990, Frank's definitely separated from his wife and is living in Tyrrell with his teenage daughter, and he's doing odd jobs for work. And that's when the next thing happens that pushes Frank back into the spotlight of the investigation. So that thing is a man named Gary Grimson, and you may remember I told you earlier to remember that name. Gary is in jail. I think he's in jail for break and enter. And he makes a confession. He tells police that prior to Helen's murder, he went to Frank's home in Londonderry with the intention of going with him and his brother Les to steal a car. He says that before the car theft, he, Frank, and Frank's brother Les drove to the dog track and picked up a blue-green FJ Holden ute.
Okay.
As in they stole one?
Well, he doesn't say that in the statement. They says they picked one up before they went to steal a car.
So this is the day when Helen goes missing?
No, this is prior to it.
Prior to Helen goes missing, he says that he and Frank picked up a pale blue, potentially Holden ute.
Blue-green FJ Holden ute.
Right.
Which Frank and he drove into the bush and covered with a tarpaulin. Then they went to a dance, and Frank apparently went out, according to this statement, went outside with a blonde woman aged 18 to 20. Gary says 5 minutes later he heard a commotion outside, and he went outside and saw Frank with this woman on the ground near a wall pulling at her clothes.
And this is all heard in court?
This is all heard in court and in Gary Grimson's statement.
Right.
So that's prior to the murder. He says that in the days after Helen was murdered, Frank's brother Les came to Gary and told him that police would be coming to talk to him about a girl that had been killed. And if he mentioned the Holden ute, he said he would firebomb his parents' home. So according to Gary, Les is saying this to him, not Frank.
Again, it's worth knowing that all this evidence from Gary Grimson and his statement is what he said in court during Frank's committal. And it's right there in the transcript of the hearing, which was released to Nina by the New South Wales Supreme Court.
Gary then says in his statement that he was taken by Frank and Les at gunpoint and had a .22 caliber rifle held against him, and he was taken into the bush in East Kurrajong, where he was forced to push the Holden ute, the same Holden ute that they'd taken and put in the bush, into the Hawkesbury River. And Frank told Gary, according to his statement, that he was now involved in a murder. And when Gary says, which murder, Frank apparently replied, the girl I knocked. He then tells him that he followed Helen home from work on her bike, grabbed her, drove her into the bush, raped her and buried her in that location where they were standing. Gary says that Frank also showed him a pair of blue underwear that belonged to Helen. So in the end, Frank lets him go.
We've tried to speak to Frank and to Les about this. We've written to Frank and driven hours to reach an empty property registered in Les's name. He wasn't there. And we've passed messages to both men through their sister and been told they don't want to talk.
What year was this that Gary provided this information?
1990. And he claims that he had waited so long to tell the truth because he was afraid of Frank.
Yep.
So again, see, he's talking about things that happened in 1968. It's 1990 at this point.
Yeah.
So that's a big accusation.
Yeah.
Right? There are some issues with that statement, and all of those issues will be later raised in court.
So all of this evidence is heard in court and it's interrogated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, the first issue that comes up again and again, Gary, I mentioned, is in jail when he makes that
Prison
statement.
informant.
Yeah, he's an informant. And he's about to
So
be...
what?
They're not looked at very reliable, and there's some professional ones in there.
Professional informants.
Yeah, don't trust anything they say. Like,
Because they're trying to get something in
Yeah.
return for informing.
Yeah. And at this point when he makes this statement, he's about to be moved to another prison. He doesn't want to be transferred because he says he has enemies at the other prison, and a court heard that as a result of him giving this information, he avoids that transfer.
Okay, so he does get something
He
out
does
of
get
it.
something
Yeah,
out of it.
yeah.
So this all becomes a bit of an issue in court. The other thing that gets brought up was that Gary was interviewed by police in 1968. Didn't say any of this at the time.
But he's kind of explained that before being asked the question, because he said, Frank said, if you say anything, I'll firebomb your house.
And what his response to that in court was that he's been afraid of Frank for 20 years.
Yeah.
The other issue that's brought up is that the other friends that Gary mentioned as potentially knowing about the crime, they'd also been interviewed by police back in 1968, 69, and they hadn't mentioned any of this. And then number 4 was kind of the most damning one for the prosecution, which was his statement said that he went to Frank's house in Londonderry. Frank didn't live in Londonderry. He lived in Kingswood, which is really close by, but it's not the same suburb. So, I mean, the police had 3 witnesses at that point, claiming that Frank had confessed to them.
And if they're looking at, and I'm not sure if it came out in the court, are they independent of each other? So they're not...
No, two of them aren't, because they're related to Frank's wife.
And they went to the police at the same time.
Okay, police at the same time. But Gary is potentially independent.
Yeah, you'd look at that.
So they had 3 witnesses claiming that Frank had confessed. They re-interviewed the relatives, and the police were pretty confident, and they made their arrest of Frank in 1991.
So they do arrest Frank, and they do charge him over Helen's murder.
In 1991, yeah. It gets delayed because Frank's lawyers immediately apply for a permanent stay. You can probably explain what that is better than me.
That's just where they stop charging him with murder.
Yeah. Please don't do the trial.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, on the basis that there'd been an extreme delay on the part of the prosecuting authorities in taking proceedings against Frank.
See, that's interesting. The reason the defence are saying don't charge Frank with murder is they're saying the prosecution took so long to do its job.
And there was an incurable prejudice which would make a fair trial impossible.
So that's their argument, is that it's impossible for Frank to mount a defence because so much time has gone past that he might not be able to find the witnesses, they might have died.
And those allegations weren't put to him in 1977.
And all of that.
I can hear that argument.
Yeah, I can hear that. But if they had interviewed Frank's brother, who Frank said was in the car with him at the time, in the weeks after the murder happened, then you might not end up in 1991 saying this thing has been delayed for so long it can't go ahead.
Yeah. And there's also mention of records and evidence being lost or destroyed. I don't know what that is precisely. So in 1993, the case did go ahead. So Frank's mother had died.
So that's his alibi witness.
Yeah. Frank's wife died in November of 1991, so she couldn't testify at the trial. Other witnesses who hadn't been interviewed at the time of Helen's murder now didn't have any recollection of things. Others, like Frank's brother Les.
Gary is frowning, and your frown is getting deeper and deeper as this goes on.
Hold on, I've got to finish this sentence because you're going to frown more. Evidence was missing, and the 2 women who went to the police, the relatives of Katrina, what I got from the records, and this is a bit of interpretation, was that they had some trouble on the stand. There was a reference in the court records to them having memory issues and the defence having issues with cross-examination and being able to do it properly because of those memory issues. So it sounds like they didn't do that well in court.
No, and I've got to be fair. It's a weak case at the start of it, and then if those issues that you're saying arose at court, I could see it going against. The frustrating part is that the police investigation is the thing that used against the prosecution.
Yeah, Frank's lawyer said that the two women who went to the police were potentially out to get Frank. So that trial ends, the jury can't come to a verdict. A second trial is held in 1995, and Frank was eventually found not guilty of Helen's murder.
Right.
So to date, Helen's murder remains unsolved.
Meaning nobody has been brought to justice decades later, and Helen's parents died without getting any answers, except that Frank Abbott, as you heard in the prison calls at the start of this episode, he denies any involvement. Helen's brother Peter, who I visited at his house and who stood beside his bicycle, waving sadly when I left him, Peter also has had no answers about what happened to his sister, and he fears he may never get them, although I think he still hopes that one day he might do.
If you had fresh and compelling evidence now under the double jeopardy legislation, you could have him retried. But
Could you, even though it's gone through 2 trials?
yeah,
That's interesting.
It's interesting partly because Gary knows what he's talking about. As a detective, Gary tried to take a man who'd previously been found not guilty back to court for murder, arguing there was now new evidence against him. That story is a whole other podcast. What matters is that it proved it could happen, that could be done. Though Gary is the only cop to date who's tried it.
it's got to be fresh and compelling evidence.
And what would count as that DNA?
If, let's say, Frank was arrested for something and found a watch and DNA, which wasn't available at the time, DNA proves that was Helen's property, that would be compelling and it would be fresh.
Gary's speaking hypothetically at this point. There is no new DNA evidence. But if there was, then hypothetically, that could be fresh and compelling. So someone's been found not guilty of murder, they can be charged again. You need fresh and compelling evidence. So fresh is something that hasn't been heard in court before. And compelling is
Speaks for itself.
compelling, yeah. How much do you need, do you think, as a homicide cop?
Yeah.
And this, we're not saying that Frank is guilty. He's been found not guilty.
Yeah.
But theoretically, how much do you think you would need in terms of new evidence to overturn a not guilty?
I think my instinct of pushing this and really taking it to the next level, if you got Frank confessing to someone and you captured that on tape, I think that would warrant an application at the very least.
We don't have Frank confessing on tape. But there is something.
Hello.
Hi, is that Brian?
Yeah.
Brian Collier is one of the first people I speak to in Johns River, the little town where Frank once lived and where we were in the last episode. Brian, my name's Dan Box.
Yeah. It's about Frank Abbott, is it?
Yeah, exactly that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Frank. I knew him well, Frank. He was very, very handy at doing things. He could like electrician, plumber, anything. And he done a fair bit of work at on my place.
Yeah.
But he was a bloke you couldn't trust if there was kids around.
What makes you say that?
Well, my granddaughter, when they were living here, they caught him, it was just starting to get dark. And she was walking up the street coming home. He was coming the other way and he ducked behind my car. Yeah, what are you doing? Oh, he said, I was just going to scare her. I thought, yeah, it'd be more than that.
What makes you say it would have been more than that?
Well, he virtually admitted to me that he did kill that girl up at Windsor.
Helen Harrison was last seen about a 10-minute drive from Windsor.
I think she was about 14.
She was 17, not 14.
He went to court for that, but the jury on 3 occasions, I think it was.
And there were only 2 trials, not 3 of them.
They couldn't reach a verdict.
But I've spoken to Brian on a couple of occasions now about this, and I'm sure it's Helen he's talking about. Yeah, I think it was Helen Harrison.
Yeah, well, I can't remember the name, but I know because Frank, he was an alcoholic apparently.
Right.
But he stopped drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And he was mowing me lawns actually. It's a stinking hot day.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked him into having a couple of beers.
Right.
And but he started to loosen up a bit, and he virtually admitted to me that he did kill her to shut her up.
What did he say?
Well, he did have sex with her, and then she was going to tell on him. So
And so what did he say he did?
Well, it was a roundabout way, the way it come out. And then he just cleaned up then, because I think he realised he said a fair bit.
Can you remember what words he used?
I'm not too sure, but I think he did say that he had sex with her a few times.
Okay.
And she was riding a push bike, I think it was. I think she said at the time. And and he picked her up and threw I think he said he had a ute.
And what did he say he did with the push bike?
I think he did dump it.
So he picked her up with her bike, maybe put the bike in the back of the ute?
Apparently.
And then did he tell you what happened next?
No, he cleaned up.
Okay. And what did you think when you heard him say that?
Well, nothing he could do because he had 3 trials and they couldn't try him again. So, that's why I was very careful with Frank. He often used to wander around Johns River here early hours of the morning, and he wasn't very well liked over it.
And did the police ever talk to you about what he said about this young girl?
No. Well, I didn't say anything about it because he had 3 trials, so that was it. They couldn't re-arrest him after that.
Brian is right about that point. At the time Frank was found not guilty of Helen's murder, the law said you couldn't be put on trial again for the same crime. So at that time, the police could not re-arrest Frank, even if Brian had come forward. But the law has been changed since. That's what Gary Jubelin was talking about, if you have fresh and compelling evidence. They can do if they have new evidence, so something they hadn't heard before.
No, I didn't think they could re-arrest him.
How would you describe Frank?
Yeah, even though I got on good with him in one way, but I was careful of him also. Because he was a bit of a deviant with kids, I know that.
You'd heard that from other people, or?
No, my grandson with another girl here, she was 14. Frank, tried to grab her.
Did he ever talk about any other crimes he might have committed, anything like that?
No. It was just luck, I think, that the things he said to me about the girl at Windsor.
Okay.
And then he shut up pretty quick.
Frank did not completely shut up. In fact, he's allegedly been telling other people similar stories. At the inquest into William Tyrrell's disappearance, there was another witness who can't be identified, who was asked if Frank Abbott ever told him about a murder back in 1968, the year Helen Harrison went missing and died. This witness gave evidence saying Frank told him, quote,
he said,
a couple of guys borrowed his car, raped a girl, and she had an epileptic fit and died. The same witness later said the same thing in a TV interview broadcast by 7 News.
And he told me he was charged with the murder over that.
This witness has since died, so we can't ask him any questions. But here's the key thing. Listening back to what he says and what Brian Collier told me, I realised neither of them is actually saying Frank told them he murdered Helen. Brian claims Frank virtually admitted that he killed her.
And he virtually admitted to me that he did kill her, to shut her up.
But that's Brian's opinion, and actually Frank doesn't say that. In Brian's version, Frank says only that he had sex with Helen.
Well, he did have sex with her.
Frank doesn't say anything else.
He just clammed up then, because I think he realised he said a fair bit.
And the unidentified witness at the inquest, his evidence is not that Frank killed Helen, just that Frank told him a couple of blokes borrowed his car, raped a girl, and she had an epileptic fit and died. So this new evidence is only that, at most, Frank did have sex with Helen. Not sure what to make of this, Nina and I keep on talking to people. Speaking to people who know Frank Abbott.
Hello, Di speaking.
Hi, Di. My name's Dan Box. I'm sorry to call you up out of the blue. His friends and family. I'm a reporter and I'm trying to get in touch with a Di Smith who's the daughter of a man called David Abbott.
Oh, that's me.
That is you.
Oh, fucking hell.
Including this woman, Di Smith, who is Frank's niece, the daughter of one of Frank's few surviving brothers. It was specifically to do with his brother.
Oh. Where do you start? Anyway, what would you like to know?
What can you tell me about Frank?
Creepy, but he never touched me. He never did anything to me that I know of or can remember. He was in Windsor. This is another thing my father told me as a kid, which I was waiting for the police to do more interviews, and I've tried to tell Queensland Police. But years ago, down in Penrith, Windsor area, there was a young girl. This is going back years and years. There was a young girl. They found her dead, and she had a push bike.
Yeah.
And she rode out. They found her in the scrub. Well, years ago, when I was a kid, my father, now I don't know why he would tell me this, but he told me that his brothers took her out into the scrub and they all had sex with her, and that she ended up dead, but no one knows how. And I've been trying to get that looked into, because if he dies, no one's ever going to know the full story. Like, why would you tell your kid that?
And you've told police this?
Well, I've tried to, yeah. Yes.
Police in New South Wales or Queensland?
No, the police in Queensland, when I've said, oh, yeah, there's some girl on a bike years ago and, you know.
And do you know that girl's name?
It was back in the 1960s, I think.
I think I know.
She was only 16 or 17.
Frank was tried over...
Yes, he was. That's the one, yes. Yeah. They tried to get him for it.
It was the murder of a girl called Helen Harrison.
That's it. That's her name. That's the name.
And I think it might be quite important that we look at that, because...
Yeah, because my father, I can just see where I am right now in the shed with him there telling me this story of this young girl that they picked up who was on a push bike. They put the bike in the back of the ute and his brothers took her out the bush and they, all had sex with her.
Di's memory is that her father David told her that his brothers picked up a young girl with a push bike and had sex with her, and that she ended up dead, but no one knows how. I've seen a version of that same allegation included in a witness statement Di gave to the police in November 2022. That statement describes Frank's brother David showing off Playboy magazines and talking about the girl that went missing. But again, not talking about murder.
Hello, is it David?
We try talking to David Abbott about Helen.
I did want to ask you about the murder of Helen Harrison. Apparently you told someone...
He doesn't want to talk.
Hello?
Hi, my name's Dan Box. Instead, I speak to some of those who were involved in Frank's trials over Helen's murder. And they say one thing that really stood out is that no one knew the actual cause of Helen's death. They couldn't work it out during the autopsy or on the evidence she was found with, which was strange. But because Helen's body was found buried in a shallow grave, everyone just thought that she'd been murdered. I speak to Frank Abbott's sister, Elaine Harding, who will be 87 this year, but remembers Helen's disappearance almost 60 years ago now. Elaine doesn't want to be recorded, so I make shorthand notes of our conversation. She says Frank would buy lunch from the local store in Pitttown that Helen worked at. She says Frank always used to chat to Helen. When I ask Elaine to describe her brother, she says Frank was a thief, that he could pick the eye out of a needle, but she never knew him to hurt a child or a woman. Elaine says she does remember her brothers saying something about a car and telling her the police were trying to pin Helen's murder on Frank, just like they did with William Tyrrell's disappearance, she says. And Frank has told her that that is definitely not true. Later, reading back over my shorthand notes of our conversation, I stop looking at something Elaine said about Helen when talking about how Frank would chat to her while buying lunch. She said, "I don't know if she was an epileptic or something," meaning if Helen was epileptic. I didn't mention epilepsy, but she's the second person now to do so, after the witness at the inquest into William's disappearance, who says Frank told him.
Apparently she had an epileptic fit and died.
Nina, who's the producer on this podcast, spends weeks going back and forth with the New South Wales Supreme Court, trying to get access to the 30-year-old court records of Frank's prosecution over Helen's murder. Nina then spends 2 days reading through these yellowing pages and finds a page of transcript from Frank's committal hearing, where Helen's old boss at the store says in court that she was taking epilepsy tablets.
I remember being surprised when I first heard about it.
I call Helen's brother, Peter, and ask him if Helen was epileptic.
Being just a child, I wasn't aware she had anything like that.
He says he was only 14 or 15 when his sister first went missing, and he didn't know anything about epilepsy until after Helen's body was recovered.
Only during the police investigations.
Okay.
Later on. I think I just heard my parents discussing it.
Yeah.
It was the police that brought up.
Okay.
Because my personal reaction was I just thought, in a shock situation, maybe that's how she died.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was just went through my mind if she had a sickness.
Yeah. Helen being epileptic could explain why no one at Frank's trial knew how she died. I call a forensic pathologist, someone who's done thousands of different autopsies, and who tells me that if someone died with epilepsy and their body was not discovered for a week, like Helen's, that fact wouldn't be something you could see during an autopsy conducted in 1968, and maybe not something you could see even with today's technology. Meaning, I don't think you can say for sure that Helen was murdered. I keep talking to her brother, Peter, telling him about the people we've spoken to about this, like Brian Collier in Johns River. This one guy who said that he'd spoken to Frank and Frank had said that maybe he was involved. And Di Smith. So she's Frank's niece. And she told me, and Frank's sister, so a woman called Elaine, and she says she doesn't think Frank was involved, but she does remember her brothers at the time talking about what happened to your sister. And the witness at the inquest, who said Frank told him about a girl who was raped and had an epileptic fit and died. Because Helen's death came up at the inquest into William's disappearance. So I tell Peter I can't prove anything. And that doesn't change the fact that what happened to her was awful and should never have happened, and that the people involved shouldn't have been brought to justice. It doesn't change any of that. Even if Helen died from epilepsy, whoever was there didn't call for help or for an ambulance. Instead, they buried her. And there are now 3 more people, on top of those who gave evidence at Frank's trial in the 1990s. There are now the 2 I've spoken to, Frank's niece and Brian Collier, as well as the unidentified witness at the inquest into William Tyrrell's disappearance. I asked Peter if he's heard anything from the police or the coroner since that evidence about his sister came up at the inquest.
No.
Which I find shocking, that the cops and the coroner would not want to contact Helen's family.
I've just been, just last night, thinking a lot about the stage in my life and trying to recall the rest of where our lives were up to, to jog my memory about things. Yeah, it's still just unsolved, and it should be, we've got nowhere with the whole thing.
And I guess you'd like that to change.
Yes.
To change things, Peter knows that the police and the courts can only act on evidence, but he also expects that when they do have evidence, they do act. So Peter's surprised to hear about the other evidence we found about Frank Abbott. Evidence that was tendered at the inquest into William Tyrrell's disappearance, including a witness statement that nobody has mentioned to Peter, and which Nina and I find among the stack of exhibits released only after the inquest hearings ended. Reading through that witness statement, we discover it links Frank to another cold case. In fact, it links Frank to 2 more.
They were gouge marks, like someone had gouged skin out.
That's next time on Witness William Tyrrell. A lot of different people have been involved in making this series, Among them, the executive producer is Nina Young. The sound design was by Tiffany Dimmack. The producers have been Emily Pidgeon, Nicholas Adams-Jasbar, Phoebe Zakowski-Wallace and Tabby Wilson. Research by Aidan Patrick. Original music by Rory O'Connor. Our lawyer is Stephen Coombs. The editor at news.com.au is Kerry Warren. I'm Dan Box.